What happens when the world's most notorious drug starts disappearing from the supply chain? You might think that's a victory. But here's the disturbing reality. When traditional heroin becomes harder to produce, the demand doesn't automatically disappear. The market adapts. And what replaces an agricultural drug can be something far more industrial, far more potent, and far more difficult to control. That's where fentanyl enters the story. This isn't simply the story of heroin disappearing. It's the story of an ancient drug economy being replaced by the age of synthetic opioids. For decades, heroin production depended on something surprisingly simple: a plant. Poppies had to be planted. They had to grow. They had to be harvested. The raw opium had to be processed into heroin. And then that product had to move through international trafficking networks. But that agricultural supply chain has been dramatically disrupted. Afghanistan was once responsible for the overwhelming majority of the world's illicit opium production. Then came the Taliban's nationwide ban on poppy cultivation. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Afghanistan's opium cultivation collapsed from approximately 232,000 hectares in 2022 to about 10,200 hectares in 2025. That's not a minor disruption. That's a massive transformation of the supply chain. But here's the problem. The demand for opioids didn't disappear. People struggling with opioid dependence didn't suddenly stop craving opioids because poppy fields disappeared. The demand remained. And when demand remains, while supply changes, the illegal market searches for another solution. And this is where synthetic opioids change the game. A poppy requires land. It requires water. It requires favorable weather. It requires a growing season. And the resulting agricultural product is relatively bulky compared with extremely potent synthetic opioids. Synthetic production operates under completely different rules. It doesn't depend on planting thousands of acres of crops. It doesn't have to wait for a harvest. And because fentanyl is extraordinarily potent, relatively small quantities can represent enormous amounts of opioid exposure. That creates a completely different economic model. The traditional heroin economy was tied to agriculture, geography, and seasons. The synthetic opioid economy is tied to chemistry, precursor supply, and clandestine manufacturing. And chemistry doesn't have to wait for a growing season. But here's where this becomes terrifying. The person buying an illicit opioid may not know what they're actually getting. Someone may believe they're purchasing heroin, but the substance may contain fentanyl or another powerful synthetic opioid. And that's where unpredictability becomes deadly. The problem isn't simply that fentanyl is powerful. It's that illicit drug markets can produce substances with unknown potency, unknown composition, and unknown mixtures. And fentanyl may not even be the final stage of this evolution. New synthetic opioids, including nitazines, are also appearing in illicit markets and are being monitored internationally. So the bigger story isn't heroin disappeared and fentanyl replaced it. The bigger story is the illegal opioid market is becoming increasingly synthetic, and that's a completely different world. And here's what I want you to remember. Addiction doesn't care where the drug comes from. It doesn't care whether it began as a poppy in a field or chemicals in a laboratory. Addiction only cares about getting your brain to demand more. That's why the answer cannot simply be shutting down one supply chain. Because if the demand for addiction remains, the market will keep evolving. Heroin can disappear. Fentanyl can emerge. Another synthetic opioid can follow. But recovery breaks the cycle entirely. If you or someone you love is trapped in addiction, don't wait for the drug supply to become even more dangerous. Get help, get honest, and start building a life where the drug isn't the center of your story. Because here at Freedom Over Addiction, we're not just talking about the changing face of addiction, we're talking about what comes after it, freedom. If this message reached you, subscribe, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, the goal isn't learning how to survive addiction. The goal is learning how to live without it.